Traveling through a trail for 2 hours, the police reached the location. Arcadio Alvarez was found in a sugarcane field. It was at that moment that they apprehended the suspect, who was accused of committing incest for about 30 years against his eldest daughter, Alba Nidia, with whom he had at least 14 children, of which 8 survived. Very little is known about the childhood and youth of Arcadio Alvarez. We know that at some point during his youth, he formed a relationship with a woman whose identity has not been disclosed, and with whom he had a daughter. It appears that his partner died in 1979, and he was left to care for the little girl, who was then 5 years old. The girl's name was Alba Nidia Alvarez, who later became known as Nidia. After the death of his life partner, Arcadio moved into the home of a relative, an aunt of Nidia's, though it was unclear whether she was his sister or the sister of his deceased wife. However, a few years later, Arcadio began to encounter problems in that house, which is unsurprising, as the man started to abuse his daughter. This inappropriate behavior began when she was 5 years old. When she was around 13 years old, Nidia gave birth to her first baby, a boy who was also her brother. For her, this situation was always a tragedy, but her father was indifferent to it. They eventually settled with his family in a small village very far from everything in the south of Colombia, where only the most basic services were available. There were barely 200 families living in the area. Arcadio was a farmer with very few resources. As a result of his precarious economic situation, upon arriving at the place, he settled his family in a fragile and unstable wooden house with a zinc roof and dirt floors. It is noteworthy that by the time Arcadio arrived in that area, the family had 4 children. For the people of the region, initially, nothing seemed too strange. They simply saw the newcomers as good people, even though they were not very sociable or communicative. Nidia was a very reserved young lady and did not socialize with the local residents. In fact, she never left the house unless she was with her father, and she was essentially only seen when going out to buy supplies for the family alongside Arcadio. Some were concerned that she was school-age but did not attend the public school in the town. However, they never inquired about the reasons why the father did not send her to school. One day, reality struck everyone when it became evident that Nidia was pregnant. If she didn't leave the house, didn't have a boyfriend, and her father exercised complete control over her eldest daughter, the only possible conclusion was that the young girl, while a minor, was being abused by her father. But even though the abuse situation was clear to everyone, no one spoke. By the time Nidia was over 20 years old, she had had 11 pregnancies, not all of which came to term, and not all of the babies born survived. Nidia never gave birth in a hospital. It was often up to someone else to help her bring into the world the children fathered by Arcadio. In the small town, everyone gossiped about this. Initially, they were horrified, but nobody said anything. Of the 14 children Arcadio and his daughter Nidia had, in the end, only 8 survived, 3 girls and 5 boys. Only Nidia learned to read and write because her father taught her. The rest had all their rights violated, starting with the right to an identity, since they were never legally registered. It was as if they did not exist. Without an essential document like the birth certificate, they could never enroll in the small local school that around 80 children attended, nor were they vaccinated or treated at the local clinic. Local inhabitants later reported that they saw the irregular couple when they went out shopping and never noticed any affectionate relationship between them. Some neighbors claimed they had the chance to talk with Nydia, but instead of offering help or some kind of support to get out of the situation in which she was the victim, they blamed her. They told her that having intimacy and children with her father was not right. Her response was always to remain silent. No one ever dared to confront Arsadio or reproach his misconduct. Later, some neighbors claimed that while he seemed like a decent man, he was extremely serious, and the people feared he might do something to them. Over time, the forbidden carnal relationship between relatives became something everyone started to accept as normal in the locality. Apparently, on a few occasions, the Alvarez's home was visited by personnel from the local Secretary of Education and the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, as well as representatives of the Catholic and evangelical churches. The goal of all was to motivate the parents to send the kids to school, but this never had any effect. To make matters worse, these organizations also failed to pay attention to the fact that the children were not legally registered. It seemed that at that moment, the wind was blowing in Arsadio's favor. However, Arsadio pushed the limits too far, and that was the beginning of the end of his sinister plan of subjugation and abuse to the detriment of his entire family. As Nydia later recounted, her father began to show interest in perpetuating his deviant behavior with at least one of his granddaughters, who was around 11 years old. And as if his immoral behavior wasn't enough, he began to insinuate to his older male children that they could do the same. This undoubtedly set off alarms for Nydia, and it could be said that a divine intervention paved the way to the end. Around that time, Orlando, a pastor from the Pentecostal church, spoke to those present at one of his sermons, including Arsadio, who wanted to appear as a correct and faithful man, about the topic of incest and what it meant, labeling it as a terrible sin. This was a turning point in Nydia's life, who, at the end of the meeting, approached the pastor to ask him to pray for her. But the stars were aligning, as around that time, the world learned about the terrible case of Elisabeth Fritzl in Austria, whose father, Joseph Fritzl, kept her captive in the basement of his own house for 24 years, fathering 7 children with her. The case of Elisabeth was so shocking that it seemed people around the world were willing to prevent such situations from being repeated. It was this story that propelled Nydia to make a definitive decision. Also, religious conviction that her father was forcing her to commit a sin, and the fear that one of her daughters could become a victim of the same man added to the need to protect her descendants from the father's brutal assaults. The man, who always had a hellish temperament, beat one of his 6-year-old sons for waking him from his nap by fighting with one of his sisters. That, apparently, was the last straw. At that moment, Nydia confronted her father who, as he always had, reacted by hitting her. This was the strategy the man had used for years to ensure obedience through fear. But this time was different. Fueled by rage and courage, Nydia fought back, something that surprised Arsadio. Nydia knew she had no other option but to leave that house. For that, she not only gathered courage but also had the full support of her older daughters. Trusting in God's will and with the strength gained from her conversations with the pastor at the first opportunity, Nydia took her 6 youngest children and fled the humble house that had been her prison. The 2 oldest male children, 18 and 16 years old at that time, chose to stay with their father. The group left and headed to a nearby town, where Nydia took some time to settle her family before formally filing a complaint against her father with the authorities. Initially, she only dared to accuse him of having beaten her young son, but later she expanded the complaint to detail the years of abuse she herself had been a victim of. Clearly, before taking any action, the authorities had to conduct an investigation to corroborate the serious accusations Nydia had made. Meanwhile, Her 6 children depended solely on her, and they were in a different town where rent had to be paid. But if there was something Nydia was an expert at, it was working hard, so it didn't take too long before she found a job at a local restaurant. She worked exhausting shifts, starting at 5 in the morning and finishing at 8 at night. She devoted 15 hours of her life daily, from Sunday to Sunday, to the demanding job that barely earned her 7,000 pesos, less than $4 at that time. In the meantime, her eldest daughter, 16 years old, took care of her siblings and became the most important support for the suffering mother. However, the authorities who heard Nydia did not make much effort to investigate what happened, and valuable time was lost for the woman and her children in terms of receiving the support they were justly entitled to from the Colombian state. The first to take real action on the complaint was a family commissioner who, seeing that the case was not being properly addressed, decided to send the information to Hugo Parra, a close collaborator of a counselor. Months had passed after the first complaint was made when Hugo, representing the counselor, arrived at the house occupied by Nydia and her children to learn firsthand what had happened. The man was completely shocked. As Hugo later told the media that covered the story, Nydia and her children were living in extreme poverty. The house they inhabited was in terrible condition, lacking clean water. The smell was almost unbearable. And of Nydia, only her shadow remained, as the 35-year-old woman looked almost 70. At that moment, it was decided to make the case public knowledge and to start a strict follow-up of the progress of the complaint. The following months were dedicated to gathering testimonies that would attest to the truthfulness of Nydia's accusations. Finally, in January 2009, it was considered that there were sufficient elements to present the case to the General Attorney of the nation. Immediately, the highest authority of the public ministry ordered a group of detectives to start investigating the facts officially and in depth. The impunity that Arcadio had enjoyed came to an end on March 27, 2009. That day, agents of the investigation team, known by its initials as CTI, initiated an operation to capture the alleged perpetrator. They had to travel 2 hours through intricate paths to reach the sugarcane plantation where Arcadio was known to be. Finally, the 58-year-old man was detained. In his initial statement to the authorities after being arrested, Arcadio maintained that he had never forced Nydia to engage in inappropriate sexual relations and also asserted that she was not his biological daughter but had been adopted. Needless to say, he also denied having intentions of abusing his daughters, much less having instigated his older sons to do so. Upon hearing her father's statements, Nydia affirmed that he used the same argument of her supposed adoption to abuse her. She added that her father subjected her to the most terrible treatments, besides having her practically imprisoned since she lived locked up and could not go anywhere unless it was with him. Among everything, perhaps the most surprising was when she claimed that he would always be her father and as such, she had to respect him. She then detailed that she always maintained in her conversations with Arcadio, when trying to reason with him, that she loved him as a father and never saw him as a man. On March 28, 2009, the trial against Arcadio Alvarez took place. There, the abuser maintained his version that Nydia was not his biological daughter but an adopted one, and stated that the two had agreed to love each other. What he could not explain was how he could have made such an agreement with a girl of 5 years old, which was the age she was when he violated her for the first time. Following this hearing, Arcadio was transferred to the local jail amidst a crowd gathered at the courthouse gates to shout insults at the abuser. The police had to act quickly to remove him from the place, as many in the crowd wanted to physically assault him. The detainee was charged with sexual abuse, violent carnal access, and incest against his daughter Alba Nydia Alvarez. By that time, the case had become well known, and the press had given it full attention. Despite everything Nydia had suffered, she showed her enormous heart as a mother during her conversation with journalists. She always stated that her greatest fear during all those years of subjugation was that her children might become victims of assaults like she was. Nydia maintained that this was something she never allowed, and she also stated that every interaction with her father made her feel very bad, and she did not want the story to repeat with her daughters, a point she had made very clear to Arsadio, warning him that if he ever laid a hand on any of her daughters, that would be the end of the docile and good person he had known. She hinted in her interaction with the media that she also resented that what was happening to her was an open secret and no one offered her the least bit of support. She confirmed that she never gave birth in a health center. All her childbirths were attended by midwives at home who knew the situation, but only asked if the new baby was the child of the same father. By that time, her oldest child was 19 years old, and the youngest was only 1 year old. In 2009, the trial against Arsadio ended, with no further details found, except, of course, that in response to the accused's claims that Nydia was not his biological daughter, comparative DNA tests were ordered. The Colombian Institute of Forensic Sciences confirmed that the man was lying, as the tests proved she was indeed his daughter. It was also revealed that the prosecution originally tried to add an additional charge for sexual acts against a minor under 14 years of age for an alleged abuse against one of his daughters, but the fact could never be proven, and in the end, the prosecution dropped this charge. The media reported that in the initial session, Arsadio pleaded innocent, but after 12 hours of hearing Nydia's valuable testimony and the DNA evidence, the accused ended up accepting the charges against him and even apologized to his daughter and his grandchildren. With his admission of guilt in October 2009, the presiding judge sentenced Arsadio Alvarez to 15 years and 7 months in prison, a sentence that undoubtedly seemed almost an offense to the victims and did not take into account the number of people whose lives were severely affected. And there was yet another incomprehensible detail. Although the reasons were not found, the sentence was later reduced to 11 years, 7 months, and some days. After the trial and under the protection of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, Nydia and her 6 younger children were relocated and placed in a house in good condition in Bogotá, the country's capital, with the aim of starting a new life away from the place where everyone knew them and would constantly remind them of what had happened. This is the last information that could be found about this family. And talking about Arsadio, the insufficient sentence was not even fully served. As in 2011, the authorities of that institution reported that Arsadio had died. According to a press release issued by the prison authorities 2 weeks before, the individual had been hospitalized for surgery due to gallstones. But the day after being discharged and returned to prison, the guards found him dead in his cell. The report stated that the death occurred due to natural causes. At the end of this case, the lesson of Nydia's courage and her struggle to provide for her surviving children remained. But the undeniable pain of so many years and the deaths of 6 little ones, either because their pregnancies did not come to term or due to being born under inadequate conditions, was undoubtedly very difficult to overcome. At the time of the events, the director of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare stated that he had never known a case of this magnitude in Colombia and expressed concern that a situation of so many years had not been denounced by anyone. The official was not only referring to a complaint from the victim, who was the most fragile and had the least opportunity to do so, but also to the community members who knew about the situation but chose to remain silent. In a conversation with the press, One of the sons who stayed with the father tried to make sense of the events from his humble point of view. But the truth is that nothing justifies what happened in this case. Nydia lived for about 30 years dreaming for freedom, but without the courage to obtain it, as the abuse started at such a young age that it left her unable to defend herself. Inside, she was a terrified child, even at the age of 30. After finally being freed from her abusive father, the woman stated that all that went through her mind was the hope that her children could have a better future, that they would study to progress in life, form their homes, and feel at peace. And perhaps the great lesson of this case is advice for other women that Nydia repeated several times to the media. She pointed out that if they found themselves in a similar situation, they should find a way to speak out, to denounce, and trust in God to move forward. For Nydia, silence was her father's perfect accomplice, not just her own silence, but that of all those who, knowing the situation, preferred to look the other way. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon.